Early summer 1583, roads into Omi. The sky hung low and wet over Omi province. Morning fog clung to the pine ridges north of Lake Biwa, softening the outlines of marching feet and creaking supply carts. Rain had come in pulses for days, soaking the high passes and turning footpaths to slick rope bridges of mud. Beneath that misted skyline, a dozen ridge forts overlooked narrow choke points, palisade outworks guarding the ancient road network threading the mountains. To control this basin was to hold the neck of central Japan. Just 10 months earlier, the thunderclap had come. Oda Nobunaga, the towering warlord who had nearly united the nation, was betrayed and forced to take his own life in the flaming temple of Honnoji. His loyal general, Hashiba Hideyoshi, rushed to avenge him. But vengeance had no clear end. The Oda clan, leaderless and sprawling, fell into bitter dispute. Old generals picked sides. Some backed Nobunaga's heir. Others eyed the seat for themselves. In Ekizen to the north, Shibata Katsuie, cautious, proud, and aging, commanded a veteran army. He had served Nobunaga for decades and believed he alone held the legitimacy to protect the Oda name. To enforce that claim, he sent his most aggressive subordinate, Sakuma Muramasa, to push down into Omi. Muramasa needed no urging. He struck first. By early summer, scouts reported enemy camps forming near the ridgeline of Shizugatake, a craggy saddle linking high ground west of Lake Biwa. Shizugatake overlooked the Omi road and the approach to Hideyoshi's stronghold in Nagahama. It was more than terrain. It was a blade at the belly of his power. Shizugatake was a natural fortress, narrow, steep, and lined with palisades. Each outwork bristled with a shigeru, foot soldiers armed with teppo, matchlock guns, and yari, the deadly spears that had become the soul of infantry shock. Drums passed signals from outpost to outpost. Behind wooden walls, fire pits were fed and barrels of powder kept dry under oiled cloth. Muramasa moved swiftly. His forces built camp on the northern side of the ridge, near the village of Otani. He believed speed could break Hideyoshi's supply line before reinforcements could move. His commanders, veterans of snow campaigns in Kaga and Noto, dispersed along the tree line, probing the slope with detachments, building up siege fires in the wet. Drums sounded at night. The rhythm told of units moving under cover. Rain thickened the air, but smoke from campfires still spiraled up through gaps in the pines. Scouts from both sides slipped through the brush, knives drawn. From the ridge forts, signal fires flared, 1 long blaze 4, approach, 2-4, engaged, 3-4, call for aid. On the 4th day, a rider came down the ridge trail to Nagahama, his horse trembling and half lame. He brought word, the enemy was pressing hard against the outworks. The forward palisades at Nakayama and the Kurikawa spur had taken fire. Muramasa's men were pushing harder than expected. In a rain-soaked tent, Hideyoshi met with his captains. None smiled. Hideyoshi, ever the builder of alliances, now faced a gamble not of diplomacy, but of speed. "We march tonight," he said quietly. "No matter the rain. No matter the roads." One of his aides hesitated. "The ridge is steep. And our powder." "Keep it dry," Hideyoshi snapped. "Change horses every league. No rest." He looked north, toward Shizugatake, its jagged spine hidden by clouds. His eyes narrowed. "We let them hit. Then we break them." That night, drums signaled the assembly. Lanterns bobbed along the river road. Horses stamped and snorted under wet saddles. From the banks of the Inegawa to the ridges above Lake Biwa, the race had begun. The storm had passed, but the wind still curled through the cypress groves like a restless scout. On the slopes of Shizugatake, where the pine needles clung thick to the muddy paths, men waited in half-dug trenches behind sharpened stakes. Campfires burned low. Smoke mingled with morning mist. Sakuma Muramasa stood at the forward ridge. A red sash tied to his armor marked him apart from the others. His orders from Shibata Katsuie had been simple: take the ridge before Hideyoshi could reinforce it. Hold it long enough to draw him into a mistake. Yet now, 2 days into the push, Muramasa refused to wait. Katsuie, stationed far behind in Ekizan's castle of Kitanosho, had counseled caution. But caution sat poorly with Muramasa's pride. We hold the high ground, he told his officers. If we break through the next outwork, the valley opens before us. He paced the ridgeline, mud on his boots and a map unrolled across a field table. His fingers jabbed at each palisade: Kurikawa, Nakayama, Toriyamoto. Small names with steep slopes. Each one built to delay him. Below, his camp spread in layers along the ridge's northern slope. Rows of ashiguru huddled under thatched coverings. Weapon racks lined the trenches, yari upright, their tips shining faint in the morning haze. At intervals, teams tended to teppo, drying their powder flasks and counting charges. Behind them, supply mules snorted, restless in the thin air. Drums beat once, long and low. The signal passed along the hillside like a spoken threat: begin advance preparations. Muramasa sent his vanguard forward. These were hardened men from Kaga and Echu, fighters who had seen snow-walled castles and river ambushes. They moved uphill in tight bands, shields raised against stray shot. A sharp cry from the trees signaled first contact. From the ridge fort ahead, defenders answered with a sudden crackle, matchlocks fired in staggered lines, smoke belching sideways in the wind. The first outwork, no more than a narrow palisade of logs and dirt, held for hours. Inside it, a captain under Hideyoshi, Tori Mototada, led 100 men. Their lines rotated between volleys: one rank fired, the next moved forward, the third reloaded. A system learned from Portuguese traders and perfected by Hideyoshi's army. When Muramasa's men surged, the defenders met them with steel. Yari braced low, tips rising from behind the palisade like the spines of a beast. A horn sounded, and the ashiguru pushed forward. Gravel shifted under their sandals. Rain had loosened the ground, making every charge treacherous. At the rear, Muramasa stood tall, watching through a gap in the trees. His scouts returned with hurried steps. Resistance holding firm, one reported. They rotate teams. Matchlocks in pairs. Casualties? Climbing. He nodded, lips thin. Push harder. Break their rotation. Still, the ridge forts were built to delay. Even when defenders fell, they did so with fire in hand, lighting fuses, casting pots of smoke and tar, disrupting every step. In the southern valleys, messengers galloped from outpost to outpost. Hideyoshi's men, still moving up from Nagahama, heard the distant drums rolling across the ridges. Each beat, spaced by the valley's echo, told of battle joined. Muramasa's staff urged caution. If Hideyoshi arrives at dawn, we risk being caught between ridge and river. Muramasa did not flinch. Then we crush the ridge before dawn. In the moonless dark, he ordered torches lit. Flame dots moved in waves up the slope, casting long shadows between the trees. Enemy banners stirred in the wind, a crescent here, a triple fan there. The names of old rivals, raised again. A commander near the front looked back, face grim. If we press too far. Muramasa interrupted him with iron in his voice: Shizugatake falls tonight. Or we die beneath it. His orders flew downhill. Men stepped into position. In the distance, wind stirred the lake's black surface. On its far shore, unseen in the dark, Hideyoshi's forces were already moving. The mountain would not sleep again. Night fell swift and heavy across the lowlands of Omi. Fog from Lake Biwa rolled inland, swallowing lanterns and muting hoofbeats. Along the Inegawa's edge, men moved in columns too wide, their breath steaming in the chill. They marched fast, with silence, each hour earned by speed. Hashiba Hideyoshi stood near the front, his horse slick with sweat despite the cool air. He had risen from peasant stock to general by mastering two skills, reading terrain and reading men. Tonight, he used both. Behind him trailed nearly 20,000 troops, samurai, ashigaru, standard-bearers, and supply teams, stretched out like a living river. They followed paths along the northern lake, river roads hardened by old stone and the tread of caravans. The ground was wet but firm. Drums did not beat. Orders came in quiet voices or hand signals. Speed, not spectacle, would win this fight. Rain misted down, steady but soft. Oilcloths wrapped the powder barrels. Extra bags of black powder were slung beneath dry straw, tied high and tight. The Teppo gunners marched near the center, their weapons checked again and again. A single spark in the wrong place could end 100 lives. Messengers dashed ahead and back, trading horses at intervals. Fresh mounts waited every few leagues, fast, small-bodied beasts bred in Mino for this very purpose. Each rider carried simple coated strips of lacquered wood, black on one side, red on the other. Red meant, delay broken, black meant, halt. Shortly before midnight, Hideyoshi pulled aside his chief strategist, Takanaka Hanbei. The man's face was pale from fever, but his mind burned sharp. "We must reach the saddle before dawn," Hideyoshi said. Hanbei nodded. "If Muramasa breaks the palisades before that." "He won't," Hideyoshi replied. "They'll hold. But only just." Further back, captains barked to the supply trains. The wagons carrying dried rice, pickled radish, flints, and spare spear tips had been lightened to quicken pace. One broke a wheel near the river bend and was shoved into the water. Time was more precious than iron. The lead scouts rode ahead into the dark, their path traced by the occasional twinkle of firefly or glint off shallow water. At the ford before Takashima, they paused. Wind stirred. To the west, thunder rolled low, drums, not storm. Signals from the ridge forts. The defenders still stood, but they were under pressure. Hideyoshi halted the column for just 5 minutes. Officers consulted damp maps under lantern glow. The ridge trail up to Shizugatake forked 3 times, one trail steep but short, one longer but wider, and the third narrow enough to force men single file. "We'll take all 3, Hideyoshi ordered. Spearmen on the wide road. Matchlocks in the center. Captains lead on foot. I want standards visible by first light." A courier galloped from behind, breathless. Enemy flares seen, Muramasa pushing hard at Nakayama outwork. Hideyoshi turned in the saddle. He spoke not to the courier, but to himself. "He's overcommit. He wants the kill." "Good." One of his officers stepped up. "Shall I notify the 7? "Wake them," Hideyoshi said. "Brief them at the base of the ridge. The counterstroke begins soon." The 7 spears, his hand-picked warriors, had not yet drawn blood. They rested near the center column, each man ready for shock duty when the moment struck. Their names were already whispered among the ranks: Kato Kiyomasa, tall and cold-eyed, Fukushima Masanori, reckless and bold, and 5 others, men of speed and violence. He would hold them until the gap opened. By the second hour past midnight, the march reached the lower slope. The gravel path turned upward, narrowing between trees. Mist swirled around torchlight. Somewhere above, smoke from spent matchlocks curled into the wind. The ridge was close. From the rear, another messenger arrived, his voice hoarse. "Powder's dry. Gunners report full charge. Vanguard requests permission to engage once the ridge is crested." Hideyoshi nodded. He looked to the east, where the sky was paling by degrees. "Permission granted. Make it count." Behind him, the march thickened. Sandals scraped gravel. Water dripped from pine boughs. No horn sounded. No drums called out. Just footsteps. And the growing heat of dawn. A thin line of red bled into the eastern sky, just enough to break the dark. The wind shifted, drawing smoke across the saddle where Shizugatake's narrow spine cut the world in half. Gravel crunched under worn sandals as Hideyoshi's vanguard crested the ridge at last. At the summit, defenders stirred to meet them, a Shigeru stationed at the forward palisade of Toriyamato. These were not fresh men. They had been under fire for days, and their armor was streaked with soot and ash. Yet when the relief came, they stood taller. One of them, a youth no older than 17, raised a short flag from behind the breastwork. The red slash on white told the ridge had not fallen. Behind him, rotating teams of Teppo gunners took their stations. One team fired. Another reloaded. A third waited. The smoke from each volley rolled across the ridge like storm cloud, then drifted down the slope, stinging the eyes of Morimesa's front line. The defenders braced for another push. Morimesa's men had already seized the lower ridges of Nakayama and the right flank of Kurikawa, but the crest remained firm. Now, as Hideyoshi's troops poured over the ridge from the southern slope, the situation reversed. Still, Morimesa refused to yield. He stood at his command point below the rise, arms crossed over armor stained with dirt and powder burns. His officers urged caution. "We should pull back and reform lines near Otani," one said. "Hideyoshi has the high ground now." Morimesa's jaw tightened. "We hold the ridge or die on it." In truth, his position was slipping. The forward palisades, anchored with pine logs and packed dirt, had survived the night only through sheer will. Now, fresh troops reinforced them. Bannermen raised new standards, Hideyoshi's triple circle, the fan of Kiyomasa, the bird claw of Masanori, each one climbing above the smoke line. On the right, 2 squads of Hideyoshi's spearmen surged into the palisade gap. Their yari drove low, forcing Morimesa's men to scatter across uneven stone. Behind the spears came fire teams, gunners in lacquered armor, their match cords lit. The volley hit hard at 30 paces. Men fell. The line buckled. Hideyoshi himself had not yet reached the crest, but his lieutenants led with precision. Niwa Nagahide, a calm veteran in gray armor, directed the flow of troops. He sent teams to reinforce the left wing and ordered signal drums to resume. The drums spoke in code, long, low beats for movement, quick strikes for danger. The rhythm rolled from ridge to valley like a heartbeat. Other units, hearing it, adjusted their pace. Morimesa heard it too. It unsettled him. He turned to his runner. "Any word from Lord Katsuie?" The runner shook his head. No response yet from Kitanosho. That silence weighed heavier than the gunfire. Up on the ridge, the vanguard held. Arrows whistled from treetops. Gunners rotated with machine-like timing. Spears jabbed through the gaps in the palisade, forcing Morimesa's Shigeru to break formation or risk skewering. "Fall back," one of Morimesa's officers urged again. "Hideyoshi will break through in hours." Morimesa drew his short blade, its edge still clean. "We hold," he said, voice flat. "We are the spearpoint of Lord Katsuie's will." Above, the light grew stronger. The sun rose pale over Lake Biwa, its reflection broken by waves stirred from the mountain wind. The day had come. There would be no retreat. The sun cleared the trees by mid-morning, casting hard light across Shizugatake's saddle. Shadows sharpened, and with them, so did the tempo of battle. From the ridge's crest, Hideyoshi's banners stretched like a river of color, triple circle, gold fan, crossed feathers, all anchored behind sharpened palisades. The high ground was his. But ground meant nothing without motion. He needed to break Morimesa. On a flattened slope just south of the crest, Hideyoshi gathered his command. His helmet glinted, the polished iron catching sunlight with each step. Nearby, drums thudded slow and heavy, heartbeat cadence, steadying nerves across the ridge. Maps were spread on lacquered boards. Positions marked with tiny wooden markers. The gaps were clear now. Muramesa's front line had overreached, pushing into the lower saddle without anchoring his flanks. "We strike the middle," Hideyoshi said. Nobunaga nodded. "If we collapse his center, the wings will fold." Hideyoshi turned to a second aide. "Bring them." Downhill, resting in the cover of cedar groves, 7 warriors stood beside their retinues. Each bore armor marked with a distinct crest: flames, waves, beasts. They were not samurai by blood, but by merit. They had risen through discipline, violence, and loyalty. These were Hideyoshi's shock leaders, the 7 spears of Shizugatake. Fukushima Masanori, broad-chested, reckless, his spear etched with ash from past campaigns. Kato Kayomesa, tall, sharp-eyed, utterly without hesitation. Hirano Nagayasu, Kasuya Takenori, Katajiri Katsumoto, Wakizaka Yasuharu, and Kato Yoshiaki completed the 7. Together, they formed a wedge meant to punch through the chaos. Each had trained for this. Hideyoshi met them on the slope, the air thick with pine resin and gun smoke. "You will strike the center," he said, voice low. "Masanori, take the lead. Kayomesa, hold the left flank. Drive them back, but keep your shape. Don't chase." Masanori grinned. "How deep do we go?" Hideyoshi glanced uphill. "Until they run." Kayomesa stepped forward, his yari resting across one shoulder. "If Muramesa stands his ground, then break it beneath him." The 7 saluted. Drummers behind them began the signal, rapid triple beat followed by a long roll. Infantry along the ridge adjusted formation. Archers pulled back to allow gunners forward. Matchlock teams rotated their barrels and checked their fuses. Spears lowered into rank order. The shock line was forming. Hideyoshi gave a single nod. "Now." 100 standards tilted forward. The ridge roared. The 7 spears moved first, down the saddle, straight into the narrowing dip between Muramesa's forward line and his scattered reserve. The enemy, already weary from the night assault, barely had time to shift. Volley fire supported the charge. At 30 paces, the teppo cracked like splitting logs. Smoke drifted low, carried west by the ridge wind. Behind that screen, the yari men surged. The spearheads caught light as they rose, then dipped, then struck. Muramesa's left flank began to bend. His center shouted orders, but too late. The shock wave had begun. Back at the command slope, Hideyoshi watched with arms folded. "They'll break him." Niwa spoke without turning. "And if they don't?" Hideyoshi's lips barely moved. "They will." The charge began with the whistle of signal arrows. Their trailing streamers marked targets for the gunners. Clusters of enemy Ashigaru huddled behind half-finished entrenchments, exposed near the saddle's narrow bend. Then came the first volley, a wall of flame and smoke that tore down the ridge. From behind the teppo line, the 7 spears advanced. Fukushima Masanori led the center, his spear high and his retinue close. He moved with terrifying speed, each step measured for impact. Beside him, Kato Kayomesa stalked the left flank, eyes cold as stone, his yari sweeping wide to clear a path. The saddle narrowed, 20 paces wide, flanked by steep drop-offs on both sides. Muramesa's men had no room to scatter. They tried to form a bristling wall of spears, but many had already spent their powder, and the wounded clogged the rear. Confusion swelled. From the ridge crest, a second volley crashed down, staggered fire from rotating matchlock teams. Smoke surged forward like a tide, curling around boots and blades. The sound was deafening, shouts, gunfire, the clatter of steel against pine logs. Masanori's voice rose above the din, "Forward! Break their line!" His spear drove through a defender's guard, twisting the man from his stance. Behind him, Ashigaru pushed hard, shields up, blades angled low. They struck like a wedge of iron. Kiyomesa's flank followed with brutal precision. He struck once, low and quick, sending a man tumbling down the slope. "Do not stop," he shouted. "Press and hold." The forward palisade cracked. One gatepost, already weakened by rain and fire, splintered under pressure. The defenders fell back, not in retreat, but in disorder. Their commander, a retainer of Muramesa's named Shima Tomoyuki, tried to rally his men near a banner post. He raised his voice over the smoke. "Hold the crest. For Lord Shibata." But the signal was drowned in the thunder of drums. Hideyoshi's men were inside the line now. From behind the enemy center, Hideyoshi's second wave emerged, Kato Yoshiaki's detachment, cutting across to widen the breach. They struck the left side, which had begun to fold under pressure. The defenders faltered. Flags dipped. Officers fell. Spears snapped beneath boot and blade. On the right, Wakizaka Yasuharu and Hirano Nagayasu poured through the gaps. They didn't pursue. They cleared. Every movement was controlled. In the smoke and slanting sun, Muramesa's red standard swayed. Their defenders, trapped in the narrow saddle, had no room to reform. Some broke downhill. Others simply stood, stunned by the speed of the collapse. At the rear, Muramesa watched from a raised position. His aide rushed up, panting. "The center's folding. Shall we fall back?" Muramesa stared at the banners drifting toward the lower ridge. His own line had thinned to tatters. "We hold one more hour," he said. "Katsuie will send word." He must. But no word came. In the valley, standards toppled. Helmets rolled down the slope. Abandoned teppo were trampled underfoot. The charge had not just pierced the enemy, it had shattered their cohesion. Hideyoshi, watching from the command slope, turned to Niwa Nagahide. "Now," he said, "we don't stop them, we steer them." The sun stood high overhead, turning the mist to steam. Shizugatake's saddle stank of powder, sweat, and churned earth. Flags drooped in the still air. What had begun as a battle line was now a flood. Muramesa's center had broken. The left had bent. Now, even the flanks lost shape, crumbling under the weight of Hideyoshi's momentum. Retreat drums began too late. The signal, a deep rolling beat followed by 3 sharp strikes, swept across the northern ridge like a warning. But drums alone could not pull back a line already scattered. Orders vanished in the haze. Messengers were cut down or diverted. Confusion ruled. Atop a small knoll near the rear, Muramesa watched his banners falter. His standard-bearer, blood on his sleeve, lowered the red fan crest and turned. "My lord," he said, voice taut. "We must signal withdrawal." Muramesa clenched a fist. His men were not broken, they were leaderless. He had expected Katsuie's reinforcements. Expected time. None had come. "Signal fallback to Otani," he said. "And prepare the rear guard." Down in the saddle, the 7 spears kept moving, not wild with blood, but locked in formation. Kiyomasa and Masanori drove forward, checking each other's flanks. They pushed Muramesa's troops off the path and into the ravines. Behind them, foot soldiers advanced with control. They claimed the ground, not just the kill. Abandoned gear littered the ridge, snapped yari, overturned crates, half-burned powder horns. Matchlock stocks cracked under retreating boots. Horses, panicked and riderless, dashed through narrow trails, eyes wide with fear. From the ridgeline, Hideyoshi raised his hand. "Hold pursuit," he commanded. "Claim position, not blood." Niwa Nagahide nodded. "They're collapsing. We could break them all the way to Otani." Hideyoshi shook his head. "Too fast, and we hit a trap." The order passed quickly: secure the ridge, do not descend. Units spread across the newly taken saddle, raising flags and reforming square formations. Engineers marked ground for temporary walls and checkpoints. The victory was real, but fragile. Below, Muramesa's officers tried to rally what they could. Tomoyuki, bruised and limping, shouted to his men, "Regroup near the third hill. We cover the retreat." But few obeyed. The call had come too late. Already, clusters of men were shedding armor, dropping banners, discarding swords to run faster down the slope. Prisoners began to appear, a Shigeru who raised both hands, exhausted, begging for quarter. Back at the forward ridge, Kayomasa surveyed the fallen. He turned to Masanori. "They ran faster than we struck." Masanori nodded once. "But we didn't chase. The discipline was the difference." In other hands, the breakthrough might have become a rout, chaotic, bloodthirsty, vulnerable. But Hideyoshi's army had trained for order in victory. By late afternoon, the enemy standards had fallen back nearly a league toward the northern lowlands. Smoke curled upward behind them, small fires, broken carts, abandoned cook fires still burning beside spilled rice. From the high ground, Hideyoshi's men watched, silent. No cheers. Just breath, and the sound of fabric snapping in the wind. Muramesa's red fan banner was the last to vanish behind the slope. The drums went silent. Only the wind remained, hot and restless, stirring ash and drying blood in the dust. From the newly won ridge, Hideyoshi's men gazed downslope at the fleeing fragments of Muramesa's army. Some begged to give chase. Hideyoshi did not permit it. The path north into Ekizen was treacherous, twisting roads through forested slopes, cut by gullies and shadowed by watchpoints. Perfect for ambush. Hideyoshi knew this terrain. He had helped map it in his youth, as a foot messenger with more resolve than rank. He stood now at the crest, armor coated in dirt, sweat streaming beneath his helmet. His commanders gathered for orders. "Do not pursue," Hideyoshi said. "Not into the trees. Not today." Niwa Nagahide nodded. "We've stretched our powder and our men. The ridge is ours. Let that speak." Scouts returned by mid-afternoon. Their reports were clear. The heat had worn down even the lightest armed troops. Ammunition reserves were nearly exhausted. Each Teppo team had fired more than 30 rounds, well above standard load. Barrels smoked from overuse. Field scribes tallied the wounded. Most injuries were minor, cuts, burns, exhaustion, but hundreds required water and rest. The wounded were gathered under pine canopies, where straw mats were laid and field surgeons unpacked herbal compresses. Supply wagons, delayed during the night march, finally arrived by the ridge trail. Crates of rice, barley, and fresh powder were unloaded. Water skins were passed hand to hand. Captains enforced rations. No soldier would overeat while others bled. Down the slope, a few stragglers from Muramesa's shattered force attempted to regroup, tiny bands led by junior officers shouting into the wind. But without signals, without drums, without banners, there was no army left to lead. Hideyoshi's discipline held. He turned to Kayomasa, who was seated on a low rock, wiping his yari with a torn banner. "I trust you know why we don't chase." Kayomasa looked up. "Because a spear thrust too far leaves the chest open." Hideyoshi smiled faintly. "Exactly." The sun lowered, its light bending across Lake Biwa like a golden path. Smoke from the morning's volleys still drifted in the air, curling among the pines. The 7 spears rested near the center slope, their armor streaked but intact. Fukushima Masanori leaned against a cart, his voice low. "If we had chased them, we could have taken Otani by nightfall." Kayomasa didn't look at him. "And walked straight into an ambush. We're not beasts." Behind them, a Shigeru collected dropped spears, wrapped broken banners, and marked positions for campfires. Drummers beat a soft cadence, march rhythm slowed to signal day's end. That night, sentries lined the ridge. Torches flickered at intervals, spaced evenly to prevent gaps in the watch. The ridge forts that had held for days were now reinforced, rebuilt with double palisades and fresh men. The fires within them burned high. Hideyoshi took no chances. Muramesa's force had fled, but Shibata Katsuie remained. In Kitanosho Castle, he would hear of this defeat by dawn. What came next would not be a raid or skirmish. It would be a reckoning. Smoke still hung low in the valleys as news reached Ekizen. Riders galloped through dawn haze, hooves striking hard against the stone roads near Tsuruga and along the Asuwa River. Each breathless messenger carried the same grim truth: Muramesa's army was broken on the ridges of Shizugatake. The ridge forts had held. The counterstroke had struck. The north had fallen back in defeat. At Kitanosho Castle, Shibata Katsuie stood at the upper keep. His hands rested on the parapet, fingers stiff from the morning chill. Before him, the courtyard stirred with clatter, officers preparing the garrison, supply sergeants shouting over wagon loads. Yet no movement could hide the weight now pressing on his shoulders. He had gambled everything on speed. Muramesa was meant to strike the ridge, seize control, and force Hideyoshi into overreach. But Muramesa had lingered. Held too long. Failed to retreat. And Katsuie had hesitated. One of his advisors, Saito Toshimitsu, stepped onto the rampart beside him. "We still hold ground in Ekizen," Toshimitsu said. "We can regroup. Defensive positions at Tsuruga." Katsuie shook his head. "He took Shizugatake," he said flatly. "He split our provinces in half." Control of Shizugatake meant control of the road network across Omi. From the lake's eastern shore, all traffic into central Honshu could be monitored, taxed, or blocked. The trade routes from the Sea of Japan, the courier roads from Gifu, even the old Nakasendo all funneled near that pass. Now Hideyoshi controlled it. In the villages below, word spread fast. Farmers who had once sworn fealty to the Oda clan's northern governors now looked south. Monks in canon temples prayed for order. Local militias disbanded quietly. Even some castle lords in Omi, seeing the tide turn, lowered Katsuie's banner without battle. The psychological blow was devastating. Hideyoshi did not press immediately into Ekizen. Instead, he sent letters. To lords. To monks. To merchants. Each message bore the seal of a commander not merely victorious, but restrained, methodical, and righteous. The signal was clear: the center of the Oda legacy now rested with him. At Kitanosho, Katsuie prepared his retreat. He ordered the castle's records burned. Gold melted and sealed. His family was escorted to the far wing. Muramesa, returned days later under cover of night, never entered the main hall. He remained in a side building, silent. Katsuie called for ink and paper. He wrote to Oichi, his wife and Nobunaga's sister, urging her to return to her kin. She refused. She had made her choice. In the following week, Hideyoshi's forces began securing outer Ekizen. Garrison posts were established at key river crossings. No blood was spilled. Resistance simply vanished. Strategically, the Battle of Shizugatake had done more than win a ridge. It had ended the Oda succession crisis. With Katsuie's defeat, no other commander could challenge Hideyoshi's claim to Nobunaga's mantle. Nobukatsu, the eldest Oda son, lacked support. Other generals, Maeda, Ikeda, Hori, turned toward the man who had built alliances and now proven he could also destroy rivals. The sword and the scroll had both passed to Hideyoshi. From Shizugatake's heights, banners still waved. The 7 spears were already becoming legend. Songs passed through camps, verses not of the slain, but of the saved. A ridge held. A charge struck. A war changed. The next spring, the roads of Omi were calm again. But Kitanosho Castle would burn before that peace truly settled. Spring deepened. The cherry trees along the Biwa shores bloomed early that year, their petals drifting across the same roads where blood had dried weeks before. Shizugatake, once a war-torn ridge, now bristled with watch posts and fresh-cut palisades. No enemy flags flew. In Kyoto, word of Hideyoshi's victory reached the imperial court with speed and ceremony. Court scribes noted the names of men elevated by action, not birth. The 7 spears were listed first. Each received rewards. Fukushima Masanori was granted territory in Setsu and praised for his boldness in leading the central charge. Kato Kiyomasa, disciplined and fierce, was awarded land near Higo. His cold precision had steadied the flank when chaos threatened. Hirano, Katsuie, Katagiri, Wakizaka, and the second Kato followed. All given stipends, commands, or castles. Not for loyalty alone, but for execution under pressure. Their rise marked a turning point in Japanese warfare, ability over ancestry. Shibata Katsuie never recovered from the blow. Weeks after the battle, as Hideyoshi tightened control over Ekizen, Katsuie ordered Kitanosho Castle burned. The flames were seen for miles. With him perished his wife, Oichi, Nobunaga's sister, and much of his household. Some said he wept before the fire took him. Others claimed he stood silent, his hand on his blade until the roof fell. Hideyoshi did not gloat. Instead, he issued a public decree, mourning for Oichi, mercy for the surviving retainers, and recognition for Katsuie's decades of loyal service to Nobunaga. It was a masterstroke, gracious in victory, generous in power. From that moment, no serious rival remained. Shizugatake had settled more than a battle. It had ended the question of succession. Nobunaga's sons were quieted. The remaining generals bent the knee or faded from influence. By year's end, Hideyoshi held not just the roads, but the capital. He would never claim the title of shogun, but his power would eclipse those who did. His rise from a Shigeru to master of the realm began not with a coronation, but with a forced march, a ridge held, and a spear thrust at dawn. Shizugatake became a symbol. The name echoed through barracks and dojos, written in ink and carved in wood. Children of farmers recited the tale. Drummers copied the rhythm of that battle's signal beats. The 7 spears were remembered, not as samurai of old blood, but as men forged in the smoke and sweat of the saddle. Their legacy endured. So too did the lesson. Victory, in that violent age, belonged not only to those who struck, but to those who struck first, with precision, and never looked back. Thank you for watching 7 Spears of Shizugatake, 1583. Subscribe for more real epic stories from history.